Right, welcome to, it's the first really, but it's the second in our Easter series. It's the first time we're actually going to look at this book here. I think you've all had a copy. If not, there's some in the lobby that you can still pick up, or you can download them on Kindle. And this is the book we're going to be using to go through over the next 3 weeks. And then in the fourth week, we're going to wrap up and look back at the topic more broadly. So, this week, we're focusing on part 1, was Jesus' death a sham? Now, this is all really about looking at whether Jesus died. Did Jesus actually die from the injuries he sustained during the description of his torture, his crucifixion, and so on? And in this book here, it's pages 9 to 29. So it took me, well, as I say, it takes half an hour to read. It's not a long section, it's only 20 small pages. And what I've done is I've gone through that and I've taken out some of the key bits in this book. I don't cover everything. You can read that yourself, but I've taken out the key bits and I'll present that to you this morning, and hopefully with what you've read, and if you want to do a bit more reading or a bit more on the internet looking around these topics, then that should really give you a really good idea about this by the time we come to discuss it later. As I said, at 5 o'clock, Dan is going to lead us through the discussion points on pages 28 and 29, and a few thoughts he's had himself as well about this. So, first point, did Jesus actually die? And I've got a picture here of a lady swooning, possibly because the man is so handsome, who knows, maybe it's a hot room. But the swoon theory is one of the main theories that keeps popping its head up when talking about the question about whether Jesus actually died. Now, what the swoon theory means is that Jesus, on the cross, when he says that he gave up his life, he didn't actually die, he just fainted, was taken down from the cross, and then, to just kind of summarise where the theories get to, when he was put in the nice cold air of the tomb, he revived, and they managed to roll away the stone, walk out, and so on. Now, this is a theory that pops up all over the place, but it's one that actually is, from my understanding, is what a number of Muslims actually follow, because the Islamic view of Jesus is that he was a prophet, but he obviously wasn't, from their view, wasn't a prophet who died and came back to life. He was a prophet that fled. Now, again, I'm not sure if this is something that Islam in its entirety supports, but this is definitely the view of some Muslims, that Jesus fled, I think, to somewhere in India, and there's a shrine about this. So it's just to make it clear that it's not just a philosophical thing, or perhaps theologists. It's actually something that is, other religions who acknowledge Jesus would say, well, no, he didn't actually die and come back to life. He just fainted, or he just swooned. And as I said, it keeps reappearing, and I put despite being widely rejected. And I did a bit of digging on this, because he says in here about the theory being rejected. And if you look at swoon theory, there's a bit of a Wikipedia entry on it. But it seems to be that it pops up, and then those theologists or philosophers, whoever, historians, from all sides, not just those who are Christians, but from atheists and so on, quite quickly discount this idea that he just fainted. And you can do some more of your own reading on that. But hopefully what we'll do today is discount that. And the first point I'd like to make is Jesus' death actually that controversial? What we're going to look at today is a really brutal crucifixion of someone. And is it actually that controversial to think that a person would die from crucifixion, would die from the injuries that he sustained? Taken completely on its own, if someone presented to you and said that person was brutally scourged, and then they were crucified, and this happened and that happened, there wouldn't really be a question about whether that person actually died. But it's because of what comes after that the question about Jesus, did he actually die, is something that people try and push back against. And it's really about whether the accounts of his death can be supported by medical science. So what I'm going to do is look at some of the points that is raised in the book, some of the things that are reported on in the gospel, and just think, is this something that science supports? Is this something that evidentially makes sense? Or are the Gospels themselves talking nonsense when they describe what happened? So hopefully we'll look through this and see whether the death can be supported by medical science. But again, this is something, if you do your own research on this, one of the things you'll come up against is this thing called the swoon theory. But hopefully by the end of the day you'll see, as most people seem to do, that it's just not tenable. Now, the first thing to know about Jesus is that he would have been in a state of severe anxiety. Jesus went to Gethsemane to pray to God, and there's a picture at the top there, painting of Jesus pleading with God, praying to God. And Luke 22 says this, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, this isn't just a simile. It's not just saying this is a picture of what was happening. There's actually a medical condition that could possibly suggest that this is actually literally describing what was happening. And it's something called hematidrosis. I'm looking at Serdar because he knows about blood, but I'm not sure if this is pronounced properly. But this is basically where, from what I understand, under situations of extreme anxiety and stress, the blood can leak into the sweat glands, and it has this appearance, like this boy here. You can just about see there that in his sweat, it's got a red tinge to it. And there's all sorts of conditions linked to this, and one of the more common ones is where people actually cry blood because there's blood getting into their tear ducts. This is all that same sort of category of things. I'm not an expert on that, I'm just presenting here what is said in the book. But again, you can do your own research on this and look at this condition. But it's just to point out that when the Bible describes drops like, the sweat was falling like drops of blood, why would they say that? Why wouldn't they just say his sweat was falling in big drops? It's a strange thing to actually say. But again, just by looking at what science knows and what medicine knows, it is possible in situations of extreme anxiety and stress for this to happen, where a person's sweat actually becomes tinged with blood. So just something to start thinking about then, about perhaps showing the level of anxiety that Jesus was suffering. Because it's only in extreme cases that this kind of thing can happen. Now, Jesus was tortured before his execution. And he was handed over to be scourged. And Dave put a picture up last week or the week before, of this, what the Romans had used. And it was a very nice picture. It was one of the nicer pictures on Google, because I did a similar search myself. And there's all sorts of videos, and people have done demonstrations of what a scourging would have been like. And it's a bit like the cat o' nine tails that was used on Navy ships a couple of hundred years ago. And you can go online yourself and you can look, and there's all sorts of videos showing people using implements like this, whips which were leather thongs, basically tied in with small bits of bone, metal balls, all sorts of things. This one's called a flagrum, and this is what the Romans used. And you'll see pictures of them hitting, they'll have, say, a pig carcass, for example, and they'll do an experiment where they're hitting this thing, and it'll show the damage that even 2 or 3 of these whips cause. So it can show you the actual level of torture before execution. Now, under Jewish law, it was limited to 39 lashes, and that's because they believed that 40 lashes was what killed a man, so it was almost bringing the person back from the point of when they died. But, of course, Jesus was being executed under Roman law, so there was no limit. So we don't actually know how many whips Jesus had in this, but we know it would have been quite severe, because even a few can cause severe injuries. Now, that thing, it cuts through the skin, muscle, and possibly even exposes the spine and the bowel. So people would have been whipped, it would have been all down his side, on his back, on his legs. We assume that he was tied up like that, facing forwards. And the injuries of this are very, very severe. And somebody who is suffering this would have been in a critical condition. They would have suffered severe blood loss. And even at this point, Jesus, by all accounts, probably would have been, well, halfway to death. He would not. This isn't a case of just a few lashes and off you go up to Calvary. This in itself was something where an awful lot of people didn't actually survive. They didn't make it through this part. Now, in Psalm 129, verse 3, it says this: "Ploughmen have ploughed my back and made their furrows long." Well, my back is like a furrowed field is another description. And that gives you an idea. Think of a furrowed field, and the furrows going in, how deep that is. That's the image here of Jesus' back. Now, what I'm not trying to do, I don't want to gross you out for the sake of it, but what I'm trying to do is, the injuries here are so severe that this alone, if someone didn't get immediate medical attention after this, even in today's medicine, they probably wouldn't survive. So just to think, when people are talking about, oh, Jesus, perhaps, the beating wasn't that bad or so on, the Romans, they used these kind of things. They weren't there to just give a few lashes. This was about really severely injuring someone, even before they even got to the point of crucifixion. So there you go, something to bear in mind about the severity of what happened to Jesus before. Now, the agony of the cross. Now, that's a picture there of where, in America, death is given by lethal injection. And it's very scientific to a point. It's done in controlled environment. But crucifixion is not an exact science. So it's very difficult when you're looking at what Jesus went through to say exactly what exactly happened to him in complete detail, how the degree of severity of certain parts of that. Because crucifixion varied massively between whoever was performing it. It was very brutal, and there was great variance in the techniques used. Some people were crucified upside down, some people were crucified upwards, some people were hardly beaten at all and put on a cross and just literally left to hang there for possibly days and days and days to die. Other people, like Jesus, were beaten up very severely before putting on. So it really depended who the executioner was, and they would have taken great joy in what they did because that was their job. And they hated, the Roman soldiers hated being in Palestine. They really hated it. It was the place you didn't want to be posted if you were a Roman soldier. So they really would have taken great joy in carrying out whatever punishments they could on the people who lived there. It wasn't controlled at all. There was no guidebook saying, well, this is how you've got to carry out this. There was no witnesses to make sure it was done in a fair and proper manner. It was just carried out in the brutal way that they could. Now, there's no doctor on hand to certify death, so we need to look at the different evidence and the different descriptions that we have in the Gospels. Today, you'd have a death certificate, possibly signed by 2 doctors, but then we don't have a death certificate as such, so we just need to look at the evidence and put that together with the suffering that Jesus had and draw our own conclusions. And again, crucifixion, it's one of those, there's a lot of speculation as to how crucifixion actually causes death. And it can vary from person to person, depending on the severity and what's actually happened to you in the lead up to a crucifixion and what happens to you on that cross. But one thing that is certain is that it's agony. Now, the word excruciating comes from the Latin excruciare, from cruciare, which is to crucify. So we use the word excruciating all the time, but it's something that's derived from of the cross. It means unbearably painful or extreme agony, or a pain like the pain of crucifixion. So this phrase, excruciating, which I'm sure we all use, we're all familiar with. I'm not sure if you'd ever thought where it came from, but the etymology of that word is that it comes from crucifixion. So if something is excruciating, it's basically like saying it's as painful as the cross. So just to give you an idea that this wasn't something you could take lightly, the crucifixion was known as a very painful death. So even if Jesus had got away lightly in relative terms with his crucifixion, it still would have been excruciating. Now, I've got some diagrams here to show a bit about being nailed on the cross. Now, Jesus would have been probably nailed through the wrists, this part here. You can see the diagram, the cross section. Now, in the terminology of the day, when people talked about the hand, the wrist was part of the hand. We distinguish between the hand and the wrist. My understanding is that when people talk about the wrist in those days, it included that. So some people say, oh, Jesus must have been through the hands, but from what I've read, if someone was actually nailed through the hands, it would have just ripped and they would have come off the cross. So they nailed through this part of the wrist here, which you can see there's a cross section here, and that's where it's showing the cross section. And it shows you exactly where it goes through. And the reason it went through there is because it locks the wrist and it holds people in place. So it locks you there and it doesn't fall down. Now you can see the length of the rolls. It was 5 to, I think it says 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 inch nails put through here, and it cuts through here. You can see the different nerves and the arteries and so on. Now this would have compressed the ulnar nerve, that's how you say it, and that, from what I understand, is a bit like, you know when you bang your funny bone and it really hurts? It's a bit like having that permanently switched on. That's the compression. So the pain from that would have been absolutely excruciating. So it's like hitting your funny bone constantly, and every now we knock it, it's a bit like stubbing the toe, that kind of thing, I suppose, and it's a bit like having that on. Now, similarly, his feet were nailed, crushing the nerves in his feet and causing a similar sort of pain. So the nails, they weren't just to hold the person there, but the consequence of hammering in the way they did was to cause this pain. Now, sometimes ropes were used, but it depended on the executioner. And if your intention was to put someone up on the cross and leave them there for as long as possible, then you probably would have supported them well on the cross and let them suffer from the sun and so on. But in this instance, we don't hear about ropes being used, we just hear about Jesus being nailed. And there is evidence that has been found by archaeologists finding remains with nails through the hands and so on. Now, this is a picture of the feet, as you can see, very similar. Possibly the nail would have gone through here. There's the cross section. One foot on top of the other, and again it compresses the nerves in the same sort of way and causes terrible pain. Right. So Jesus has already been terribly beaten, suffered terrible blood loss. He's now on a cross, he's got these nails in, and he's suffering terrible pain. Now, his arms would have been pulled out, And we believe that the fact that he was nailed, some people believe that he was put on the cross member and then that was hoisted up and then attached to the upright. Others believe that he actually would have been nailed to a cross form and that would have been hoisted up. But either way, being hoisted up when you're nailed into something is going to be pretty painful. And the suggestion is that he would have had his arms stretched right out, and this would have caused both shoulders to be dislocated. So I've never dislocated a shoulder, but I understand it's quite painful. But both Jesus' shoulders would have been dislocated. And this really, if you look back at Psalm 22, he says, I am poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint. And again, it's another nod to prophecy when it talks about the specifics in the Old Testament of Jesus' crucifixion. Here's another example where experts believe that anyone who's crucified with that weight on them, it would just dislocate his shoulders. And again, it's talking to Jesus saying, my bones are out of joint. And again, how accurate that is. So that's another level of suffering that Jesus would have gone through. Now, the cause of death, and there's some question about this, exactly how people die. And again, it varies from person to person. But here's the two probable causes. Now, the weight of the body pulling down on the outstretched arms and shoulders would tend to fix the intercostal muscles in an inhalation state and thereby hinder passive exhalation. So a person wouldn't be able to breathe. So the way that you've actually been held like that, dislocated, you would struggle to exhale because of the way things are going. Victims would only breathe shallow breaths, eventually dying from asphyxia, so they'd suffocate, or from shock. Now, when you think about the massive injuries that Jesus would have had from his scourging and possible blood loss from that, and you think about the nails and so on, it's possible that Jesus would have gone into shock. But also this idea that he could, it says here they knew when death was near. Apparently in this situation, when the heart starts speeding up, people are taking very slow breaths. It's almost as if people get a sense that the end is near. And you get that from Jesus because he says, Father, into my hand I place your spirit. And then he says it is finished. So Jesus knew his own death was coming. So it suggests here that it was this kind of suffocation, this inability to pull himself up to breathe out, which really caused it. But again, lots of suggestions. It depends exactly how the crucifixion was done, but that's the most likely. There's just a diagram here that shows you about how someone would have to twist their wrists to be able to lift themselves up or drop themselves back down again to breathe. And as you can imagine, pushing down on your feet as well to try and lift you would have been incredibly painful. Blood and water. Now this is a picture of a Roman soldier with a spear about to spear Jesus in the side. And this is quite an interesting descriptor in the Gospels, because it talks about they wanted the bodies off because of the Passover. They wanted them all down from the cross. So the Roman soldiers set out to break the legs, and the reason they broke the legs was so they couldn't lift themselves up to exhale and they would have suffocated. But they came to Jesus and he was already dead. How did they know he was already dead? Why didn't they break his legs? Well, the soldiers must have been sufficiently convinced that Jesus was dead. So what they did, rather than waste time bashing his legs, and obviously we'll come on to look at that about the prophecy about Jesus not having bones broken, but they decided to pierce him with a spear. Psalm 34:20 says he protects all his bones, not one of them will be broken. So the fact that the soldiers didn't go around and break Jesus' legs as well, again, is a nod to prophecy. But they did put a spear in his side, and it says that blood and water flowed out. Now, a suggestion is this is pericardial, that's heart, and pleural, that's lung, effusion. So around the heart and around the lung, there's like a sac which contains a level of fluid, which can increase under certain situations. There's illnesses that cause it. But also under this, because of what's happening to Jesus' body, the suggestion is that both his heart and his lung, this sac which contains his fluid would have swollen, and then by being pierced, both blood and this fluid, which appears clearish, that looks like water, would have come out. And it's a sign that his heart and his lung were pierced. Now, this is a heart. And again, I'm not a medical expert, but this is how I understand it. There's a thin membrane that covers the heart. Under intense stress, you can fill with clear fluid called pericardial effusion. And you've got the heart here, and then you've got this sort of sac here of this fluid. And here's a diagram. It's not that clear, but there's a cross-section there of the spear going into Jesus' right side, about there, and it would have gone in. There's the lung. There's the sac of fluid there on the lung, and it goes through here and pierces the heart where the sac of fluid is around here. And of course, you would have this fluid coming out, and then the blood. Now, one of the points that he mentions in the book is that the description in John is about blood and water, whereas in this situation it would have been the fluid that came out first, followed by blood. But whereas we today tend to write things chronologically, in those days they tended to write by significance. So because blood is more significant than water, that's why it said blood and water came out, whereas we probably would have said water, then blood came out. So again, the suggestion is it's not a chronological account of what actually came out, it's just a record of the significance of they came. Just a different style in those days of recording things. Now, the Roman soldiers were experts at killing, I've already mentioned that. And they all had their own style, and you can imagine them, perhaps in the officers' mess talking about different ways of causing more pain and how they're going to go about crucifying people the next time. And they had their own style of crucifixion, and they would have made sure that Jesus was dead, hence the spear. The spear wasn't normal. They didn't usually spear people on the cross. That was just something to make sure that person was dead. And the reason is that if these executioners had failed to kill someone, they would have been killed. Their officers would have taken and punished them and probably done to them what they should have done. So it was absolutely in these soldiers' interest to make sure that their victims died. Absolutely in their interest to do that. So some people think, perhaps the soldiers couldn't be bothered, they didn't do a great job. Not only would they probably have enjoyed what they were doing or relished it, but even if they didn't, there was a real incentive on them not to fail to carry out the execution properly. So whether or not they were like this and they had this, we know that Jesus was mocked, we know all that. So the chances are they were really relishing what they were doing, but they wouldn't have been careless. They really would have made sure that Jesus was dead. And the question is, could Jesus have survived? Bearing in mind the injuries he has, and I haven't even talked about the crown of thorns on his head and various other injuries that he suffered, could he actually have survived those injuries? Well, in this book, it concludes that he couldn't have. But even hypothetically, if we say that Jesus could have, despite all the injuries he was covered from the scourging, despite the fact that his wrists and his feet have been pierced, and all the other injuries, the piercing his side and the fact that his heart and his lungs were pierced, if he could have survived that when he was taken down from the cross, and if he could have been revived, what state would he have been in? What state would he have been in to walk around? I mean, it's hard enough if you've got a blister on your foot, but if you've had nails through your feet, how are you going to walk around? How are you going to do anything if you're in that state? Would the half-dead Jesus have inspired his followers? Think of how people responded to Jesus. Think of Thomas when he said, "My Lord and my God." There was that recognition. We'll go into Jesus' appearances in the third section of this series. But just think to yourself, if Jesus had actually survived this with all his wounds and he just staggered out of the tomb, and would people really have been inspired by that to give their lives, to dedicate themselves to him? I mean, the disciples were scared. They went from being terrified to being incredibly brave. And would a wounded Jesus in that way have done that? So the evidence points to Jesus dying from his injuries. The evidence that that's in this book that I've looked at through wider research, it's very hard to think that Jesus didn't die. And I've got no real reason to say he didn't. I mean, the Romans are expert at crucifying people. Why wouldn't he have died from these things? So just a few summary points. Jesus would have been in a serious or even critical condition even before he was nailed on the cross. So those wounds alone probably would have been enough to kill someone. Death on the cross would have been from asphyxiation. The effusions from the spear wound are evidence of death. The Romans were experts at killing. Jesus could not have survived. Left alone appeared and inspired. And this conclusion, which is in this book, is inspirations based on the assumption that Jesus didn't die on the cross, appear at odds with modern medical knowledge. So if you're examining this from a purely in isolation about a person who went through what Jesus went through, medical science would say he died. It's only because of what comes after that people want to question whether Jesus actually died. So this week, all I really want to focus on is this question: did Jesus die? Just think about that and settle in your head whether you're convinced that Jesus actually died, or whether you think, oh no, there's some doubt there. And if so, read a bit more, research it a bit more, and try and come to a conclusion. Now the question that's not answered is this point, why? And this is in Isaiah 53. Now, if you've not read Isaiah 53, it's actually the end of 52 and chapter 53 you need to read. I strongly suggest you read that before this afternoon's study, because it really is a detailed description of why Jesus went to the cross. We've looked at the what happened to Jesus and how he was killed and so on. But the why is the baffling thing, and the why is why the historians can't possibly explain. But I'll just read this to you. It's from Isaiah 53, and I've taken two verses out, that's all. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. Let's pick out some things there. He was pierced. Well, we've looked at the nails. He was pierced for our rebellion. He was crushed for our sins. He was beaten. Well, we know that Jesus was beaten. He was scourged so that we could be whole. He was whipped so that we could be healed. All of us like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. So the reason Jesus came to do this, the why, is love. God's love for us. Jesus' love for us. That's why he came and went through all that. That was why it was necessary for him to die. So again, we've looked at all the hows and so on, and hopefully you've concluded by reading this and by what you've heard today that Jesus did actually die. If you've still got doubts, then do some more reading. Come and chat to me. We can have a bit of a debate about it. But I hope you come to that conclusion. And I strongly then, if you want to know about why, have a look at Isaiah 53. Just look at the points in there it describes about Jesus' sufferings. Look at Psalm 22, that's another one that talks about Jesus' sufferings on the cross. Look at the detail in there that we can see in the Gospels and that we can see through this evidence. And just try and understand this love that God has for us. Just have a prayer. Our loving Heavenly Father, the most important thing about Jesus on that cross is the why. And we thank you it's because you loved us. We thank you that he was willing to die for us, and we thank you that you were willing to send him to punish him for us. His sufferings were terrible, Lord, and there can be no doubt that he died. There can be no doubt that what he went through was so severe that no one could have survived it. But, oh God, we just thank you that he was willing to come and die for us. We just ask now that you help us to understand this. Help us to realize what it means to us. And help us also to think about this before our study later, Lord. We ask you to be with Dan later as he prepares this. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Tom.
Oh, Jennifer.
So, as we said already, the study tonight